distracted by looking at that screen. Um, so, Antra, I'd let you start, and then,
Yes,
yeah.
sure. Thank you. So thank you, Aditi, and very good afternoon to everyone here. I can see many people here actually. So very warm welcome to everyone on behalf of the Department of Humanities and Social Sciences, ISA Bhopal. So this is the second talk that we are hosting in this ISA Bhopal Humanities webinar series. A talk by Dr. Alexander Dunst today. And thank you very much, Alex, for being here, and a very warm welcome to you. And like we said, like I said, when we started this series last month, for all the distress and suffering that the pandemic is causing the world over, it has also given us opportunities to connect with people worldwide and opportunities to listen to people from all over the world. And we have such an opportunity today to listen to Alex, who is going to talk to us from Germany. So I'd like to thank my colleague Aditi for inviting Alex on our behalf, and also for coordinating this meeting. Thanks, Aditi. Thanks, Alex. So today, Alex is going to talk to us about experimenting with the humanities and Raymond Williams and the method wars. So with that, I will hand over to Aditi for the formal introduction of Alex, and we look forward to Alex's talk. Thank you, everyone.
Wait a second. So, hello. Yes, it's thanks, Antra, and it's my great pleasure to have Alex over. We've been friends for 15 years now, and almost, and wonderful scholar. So we studied together in Nottingham, where he did his PhD in critical theory, and he's now assistant professor of American Studies at Paderborn University, Germany, where he's also currently acting chair of digital humanities. His recent publications, I mean, there are quite a few. They include, the first one was Madness in Cold War America, if I'm right, and then he's published a book called Empirical Comics Research with Routledge. He's also co-edited the essay collection, The World According to Philip K. Dick, published with Palgrave. He's published in sort of top journals on subjects ranging from American culture, film and media studies, digital humanities, critical theory and cultural studies. And his research draws together work on contemporary US fiction, visual narrative, history of psychiatry, and cultural discourses of madness. And recently, he has co-directed an early career research group titled Hybrid Narrativity, Digital and Cognitive Approaches to Graphic Literatures, which has brought together experimental psychologists, computer scientists, and cultural theorists. So he's been bridging this gap between the experimentalists and the theorists, which is amazing. And I'll hand this over to Alex now, whose talk I'm really looking forward to. And just a couple of housekeeping announcements. If you have questions, please do sort of type them in the chat window, and please keep your videos off and your audios I've switched off anyway. So great, thanks.
Okay, thank you very much for the intro and the invitation. I hope everyone can hear and see me all right in that little box. You have a little box with my face. I'm not the same guy who's sitting in front of that English cottage, or probably it's a Welsh cottage. That's actually Raymond Williams, and I'll start with him in a little bit. So again, let me thank the department and Aditi and Antara for inviting me to talk today. It's amazing that we can actually do this. I wish we could all be together in Bhopal, but I'm also getting the impression that maybe there are listeners here from lots of other different places. So it's great that we can find a way to communicate here. as Aditi said, I guess the easiest way to ask questions, which we'll do after the talk, is by either posting them in the kind of chat or maybe giving your name in the chat, and then and you can speak. So I'll talk for about, or try to talk for about 40 to 45 minutes today. I've been teaching a lot of classes over Zoom this semester, as a lot of you have, I guess. And my impression is that listening to anyone for longer than that is simply impossible. So I'll try to keep to that. Just a few things before I launch into the talk. I'll start with some thoughts on and a quote by the literary historian and cultural theorist Raymond Williams, who you see here. I'll say more then about current research that is in the process of expanding how we understand the humanities, and in particular, I'll talk about the digital humanities and about experimental aesthetics. And in doing so, I'll use some of my personal experience that Aditi has mentioned in these fields over the last 5 to 6 years, think about how we can bridge the divide between humanities and experimental research. So parts of this talk are really quite pragmatic. I hope they're not too banal in being pragmatic. 2 quick clarifications. When I speak about humanities here, I'm mostly really talking about the parts of the humanities that I know better, literary cultural studies, both in their kind of theoretical, interpretive, and historicizing varieties. And when I speak of experimental or experimentation, I don't mean that term in a kind of wider sense or a kind of loose and metaphorical sense, that these forms of humanities research that I call the experimental humanities are novel or untested, that they're innovative or exploratory. I do actually mean this in a narrower sense, the term experimental, that refers to kind of formalized procedures that emphasize repetition in the confirmation or falsification of explicit hypotheses. I see that someone has raised their hand, Aditi. Is there anything that we can do about that raised hand at the moment, or should do?
So if anybody has questions, please do write in the chat window, which is being watched, so that, you know, and Alex can just sort of continue talking without distraction. So if you have any specific questions, please do ask in the chat window.
I do, yeah, thank you, Aditi. I do think it's easier maybe if I do the talk and then we take questions at the end. I sometimes encourage people to just raise their hand if we're in a seminar room, but I think it's slightly more cumbersome to do that here. So bear with me. Okay, so I'll start with the first part that I've called the unfinished project of materialist recovery. And I want to start by giving you a short quote and then expanding somewhat on that quote. So we're going to leave the cottage and go to this quote, which is taken from Raymond Williams's Politics and Letters. And Williams, who I'm sure a lot of you know, had an outsized influence on the development of what is commonly known as cultural studies via the Birmingham Centre for Contemporary Cultural Studies in Great Britain in the 1960s and 70s. And he remains a presence today in these fields of literary sociology, literary studies, cultural studies, critical theory, and some of his concepts, including the famous structures of feeling, have become part of a kind of general academic vocabulary. Now, here's the quote that I encountered, and I encountered it in a very specific place, namely in the review of the well-known work of Franco Moretti in Digital Literary Studies. I'll read the quote to you. Indeed, if I had one single ambition in literary studies, it would be to rejoin them with experimental science. Now, what's so strange about this sentence rather. I think the sentence is very much out of tune with how we think not only of cultural studies, but of the study of literature and culture more generally. Interpretation, critique, history, close reading, those are sort of the approaches that we usually think of when we think of literary and cultural studies. And therefore, Williams's pairing of literary studies and experimental science in the sentence is unsettling. Aren't these two supposed to be kind of opposites or at least parallel strands of scholarly endeavor that really intersect? Not really in this kind of sentence. So even if we don't subscribe to C.P. Snow's polemic about the two cultures, about the kind of unbridgeable divide between the natural and the engineering sciences on the one hand and the humanities on the other, the force of Williams's pairing may surprise us. And in fact, there's a good chance that Williams's sentence here, his pairing of experimental science and literary studies, is a kind of late rejoinder or an echo to C.P. Snow's lecture and then book that came out in 1959. But I want to consider this sentence a bit more closely. So if I had a single ambition, I would. Clearly, from the construction of this sentence, Williams doesn't think that his work has one single ambition. And in fact, his work was extremely wide-ranging, from kind of literary history to Marxist theory to sort of autobiographical novels that he wrote. But the grammatical construction, phrased as a conditional clause, also looks back at the past, and specifically as the simple past indicates, at a chapter that is closed in the past. But Williams did pursue this single ambition. And I want to show you a bit more what that meant by giving you a slightly longer quote, actually from the same page, the same kind of discussion in this interview. And again, I'll read this to you. Years ago, I tried to set up some actual experiments of what happened to physical rhythms in certain reading contexts. But such was the atmosphere of specialization that the work was never done. I believe, however, that we have got to move towards active collaboration with the many scientists who are especially interested in the relations between language use and human physical organization. So Williams here refers to reading experiments he tried to set up that measured unspecified physical rhythms. Possibly these measured breath, heart rate, or some kind of brain activity, possibly measured by EEG. The work, he then tells us, never took place due to the atmosphere of specialization. And if you work in academia, I'm sure you have encountered this atmosphere of specialization, and we'll come back to talk about this a little more in what follows. Now, here's a third quote, again from that same discussion. And this quote clarifies, I think, some of the ambition that Williams pursued unsuccessfully. What is needed is not a blending of concepts of literature with concepts from Lakhan, but an introduction of literary practice to the quite different practice of experimental observation. That would be the materialist recovery. Now, I have a slightly different position on Lakhan than Williams, in part because psychoanalytic theory is based on its own qualitative but experimental practice, namely the kind of face-to-face encounter of therapy. But what's more interesting about this final quote, I think, is the emphasis not on an imputation of concepts that often can become unmoored from their methodological context, but an emphasis on a novel form of research, namely a meeting point between literary practice and, as he says, the quite different practice of experimental observation. Now, before I move on to academia today, let me say something about the last phrase here that I put in the title of my first part, materialist recovery. What does that mean, materialist recovery? Let me just have a quick look at the chat to see. Oh, Lakhan means Jacques Lacan, yes. Sorry about that. So what does Williams mean by this phrase? Now, over the last few decades, scholars from fields as varied as philosophy, literary studies, or the history of science have done much to critique idealist notions of subjectivity and personal agency. Yet at the same time, literary and cultural studies, what Williams calls literary practice, is still dominated by the hallowed figure of the critic or scholar whose mind produces the brilliant interpretation or insight that the humanities value more than anything else. Thus, in the humanities, we might claim a materialist conception of our objects of study, whether that's film or religion or literature. Yet, I would argue that we've failed to develop equally materialistic and materialist methods of study. So on the one hand, a strong critique of idealist notions, but on the other hand, a kind of practical hanging on to this idea of the brilliant, unique subject of the critic and the insights that this critic produces. Now, Williams made these statements at the very latest in 1979, so at least 41 years ago. A lot has changed since. Today, of course, we are in the era, at least rhetorically, of interdisciplinarity, of transdisciplinarity. I don't know Indian academia that well, although I did spend some time in India at a couple of universities. But if it's anything like other academic cultures that I know, if you're applying for a grant, very often you have to just add these words, interdisciplinarity, transdisciplinarity. Yet very often interdisciplinarity remains limited to circumscribed branches of research. Literary scholars read philosophy and history. Biologists incorporate the complex model of statistics, but there is no transdisciplinarity in the sense, at least in my experience very often, between, let's say, the natural and engineering sciences and the humanities and social sciences. So when literary scholars actually read work, say, from cognitive psychology, they use the results of this research as the basis of their theoretical speculation. But rarely does this have any impact on their actual working methods. These results are kind of picked out of existing work and taken over as insights without changing anything about the methodological apparatus. So I'll give you an example. A couple of years ago, I reviewed a book by a German scholar called Vera Nünning called Reading Fiction, Changing Minds, the Cognitive Value of Fiction. This was very much a book in the kind of growing field of cognitive literary studies. And it was very much based on kind of the results of decades of empirical research in cognitive psychology. But there was no empirical work and there was no kind of empirical methodology. In fact, at some point, Nünning wrote, "I will not conduct empirical research in order to support my hypothesis." And I think this is quite typical. We take what we need without really changing anything about the way that we work. And this also applies to the other side. One of my favorite examples of this is an article published in Science in 2011 titled, quote, "Quantitative Analysis of Culture Using Millions of Digitized Books." Quantitative analysis of culture using millions of digitized books. The article has 13 authors. They're all from mathematics, biology, computer science, physics. They all have very impressive credentials, but the results are extremely meager. They're banal to the extreme. And one of the reasons, I think, is that none of the authors has any background in literary or cultural studies. So again, the methodology remains unchanged and is simply applied to a different object of study without actually engaging with that object of studies. And I think what makes Williams so interesting in this regard, despite the fact that his comments are 41 years old, is that he goes much further. The active collaboration that he calls for involves a kind of sustained meeting point, an encounter between disciplines, and the construction of a shared scholarly practice. Aditi, can I ask here quickly, how are we, can everyone hear me? This is always a bit difficult to know. It feels like you're speaking into a void if you do these things.
And I think if someone can't, they can probably write in the chat window that they can't. But okay. If I can, that means that it's probably something on their end. So
okay. That means I'm reaching you. Okay, well that sounds positive. I saw there was some discussion on Lakhan in the chat, and maybe we can engage with this later. Although I don't think he's really all that central to what I'm saying here.
Yeah.
Now I'll come to the second kind of part very soon, and to what Rita Felsky has called the method war, kind of martial metaphor. For much of the later 20th century, the humanities were intensely theoretical, you could say philosophical even, in part because certain strands of theoretical inquiry, often called continental philosophy, found a home in literary departments. In part, the humanities were also intensely theoretical to understand the kind of victories of conservative political parties in the wake of the 1960s and the neoliberal reforms, I'll put them in quotation marks here, that followed. But according to Felsky and others, the last decade, so the 2010s if you want, has seen the era of high theory give way to what she calls the method wars. And as part of these wars, of these heated debates in the humanities, interpretation and historicism are being challenged by a range of different approaches. And she lists effective readings, surface reading, distant reading, and literary sociology. And I'll come back to some of these in a minute. There's another way to phrase this, less martial, that I actually prefer and that I think is more precise. I'll quote this. It's by James English, who's a literary historian as well. He writes, "We are experiencing a much more concerted effort than occurred in the late 20th century to recalibrate the entire analytic apparatus of literary study." Kind of rethinking of the entire set of methodologies underlying literary studies. Now, as I said, I want to focus here on two efforts to recalibrate, to rethink, and to challenge this apparatus, this analytic apparatus, the digital humanities and experimental aesthetics. Now you might ask, why these two? Now, I think in contrast to currents such as affect theory and surface reading, it seems to me that the digital humanities and experimental aesthetics share two important methodological departures from much of what was happening in literary and cultural studies, at least since the 1980s, maybe even going back to the 1960s. So two methodological departures, I'll talk about these quickly. First, in parallel with much of the sciences, these fields place experimental procedures at the center of their research practice. And this is obviously where the title of my talk comes from. Now, the shape of these experimental setups differs from data experiments to reception studies in actual laboratory environments. But in both cases, the digital humanities, which usually work with data experiments, and the experimental humanities, which very often work in a laboratory environment, what the historian of science Hans-Jörg Reinberger has called experimental systems, so the kind of physical, technical, and procedural basis for experiments, are central. So experimental procedures are central to both of these approaches. They're not just experiments in the narrow sense, but experimental setups, the physical, technical, and procedural basis for experiments. Obviously, if you conduct experiments, you need methodologies, you need data, you need models, you need computers, you might need other sort of machines for your experiments. So this is the first methodological departure, putting experiments at the center of this research project. The second, and as a consequence, what becomes an object of knowledge in these two approaches differs from the study of literature and culture at large. Now, for the interpretive currents of literary and cultural studies, the object of studies was simply the text very often. And what that meant could differ. It could be a relatively abstract notion of the text in kind of close reading, where perhaps you looked at acknowledged masterpieces, to an emphasis on the kind of historical variability and material construction of literary works. Let's say if you worked in textual scholarship, or if your work was in the history of the book. In contrast, the digital humanities might define its object of studies as, I'll give you a few examples, world literature in Franco Moretti, 19th century literature in Matthew Jockers, or somewhat more modest in my own research, the English-speaking graphic novel, or in the case of Lauren Tilton, American network sitcoms. So none of these are individual texts, and I think that is important. Rather, they look at what they understand as literary systems or cultural fields. Now, why is this shift from the individual text to the literary or cultural system important? Usually this shift has been described as a kind of opposition between close reading and distant reading. And maybe you've heard this unfortunate, in my opinion, term, distant reading, that is associated with Franco Moretti. It's a sometimes reductive, but ultimately misleading metaphor. I think more importantly, shifting our attention from a single or a few texts to a literary and cultural system, and analyzing the system with the help of experimental procedures, means that the system needs to be defined in a strikingly different manner, that our object of study is entirely different. To use different terms, researchers now need to formalize a model of that system, because we rarely ever study every single element in one system. Therefore, what constitutes parts of the system, its characteristics, and how those parts of the system relate to the whole and the internal dynamics need to be made explicit and quantifiable in ways that can be processed by a computer. And importantly, both of these, modeling and computational processing, put additional demands on humanities scholars. Most of us have not been trained to do this sort of work. And to meet these challenges, we need the support of researchers in other disciplines, in computer science and statistics, in mathematics, and the social sciences. In other words, what we need is what Williams called active collaboration between literary practice and experimental observation.
Alex, sorry, just didn't want to interrupt. Yeah. I think some of
the
participants are getting worried about the slides not changing. So just let them know that they're not supposed to, perhaps.
Yeah, they are not supposed to. I'll come, it's pretty boring to have this quote. So I'll put something else up, but I'll come in the third part now to some different slides. And I have, let me see, 4 more slides. So there's not that many overall, but we're not stuck on these slides. So let me put these on. So I'll come to the third part, and to my own experiments and my own experience with the experimental humanities. And here I'll reflect on some of the kind of practical changes of what I've mapped out, the experimental humanities. Now, some of the thoughts that I've presented so far today were the impetus for a workshop I organized in last November, and you see the poster, the sort of futurist modernist poster that a very talented designer did for us. Now, this workshop took place at something called the Institute for Cultural Inquiry in Berlin in last November. It featured keynotes by Nishant Shah, who's an Indian scholar now working in the Netherlands on digital media studies, and an Australian scholar, Vanessa Agnew, who was talking about the uses of virtual reality in historical reenactment. And after that, we had some shorter papers by about 10 to 12 scholars, including myself. Now, as part of the later session, I gave a short paper presenting some of the remarks that I've made today in the form of 5 short theses. And the response was a kind of mixture of icy silence, I would call it, and open rebuttal. And the accusation was that I wished for a return to notions of absolute truth and objective truth. Now, I hope I can sort of accept criticism. So my reason for mentioning this workshop and the reaction to my talk isn't so much to sort of answer the critics. Rather, my interest is somehow different, namely to ask what continues to make the active collaboration or even communication between experimental research and critical scholars so different 41 years after Raymond Williams admitted his own failure. Why is it that this continues to be so difficult, even at a workshop that was set up explicitly with the aim of bringing these different currents together? Why did this fail completely? Why do we go through this repeated failure? Now, in a sense, even trying to bridge this divide might really be a sign of hubris. After all, Williams was a far more capable scholar than myself and probably most other scholars. And he did work at a time when some of these empirical approaches, including Bourdieu's literary sociology and the ethnographies of youth culture at the Birmingham Center for Contemporary Cultural Studies, flourished really. But then again, as I said earlier, scholars like Felsky and James English have emphasized that the humanities are currently undergoing a period of methodological renewal, at least of methodological self-questioning. So if not now, if we can't bring these approaches together now, then when? So here now are 3 points that may add, from my own experience, this active collaboration between the humanities and social sciences. And these arguments range from the somewhat banal to complex questions of methodology. I've termed them communication, interest, and methodology, and they start shorter, and then the methodology part is somewhat later, and I'll stop with that. Okay, so communication. And I warn you, this is the very pragmatic, even banal part that perhaps comes from my own painful experiences. Now, in this experience, researchers, like most other humans, can be intensely tribal in their ideas and assumptions. We tend to place greater value on our own achievements and those of groups we identify with than others. And we see this outside of academia too, of course. Thus, researchers may judge their own discipline more important or more methodologically advanced than others. In most cases, this attitude derives from the greater knowledge we possess about our own discipline rather than from the inherent shortcomings of other fields. Now, specifically in encounters between the humanities and the sciences, this situation has been further skewed by the greater prestige that the natural sciences and some of the engineering sciences currently enjoy. Of course, this in itself is a very recent phenomenon, and it has its roots in the questionable notion that the sciences produce more economic profit than the humanities. In other words, those that pay for research to be undertaken are more interested in the fact that they believe that the sciences produce more profit, although there are studies showing that this is not the case, rather than in any inherent superiority of the sciences. And I think on the part of humanities scholars, these prejudices lead to a certain defensiveness. And I think that played a part in the kind of reaction that I felt at this workshop and the inability to engage with each other. And this defensiveness, in turn, often stems from the very real limitations of funding and the threat of further funding cuts for the humanities. And overcoming these hurdles is therefore no small feat. In my own experience, even if we get to a point where we get past these prejudices, they tend to come back at times of conflict. And when you work together in a long-term kind of research project, as most of you know, there will be times of conflict. So this is an ongoing challenge, if you want, a kind of banal social communicative challenge, but one that I think continues to rear its head. Okay, so that was communication. I'll come to interest. Beyond goodwill, the goodwill to communicate as equal partners, there are some very real areas of overlap between the humanities and social sciences, and I would argue that these areas of overlap, of productive overlap, have never been greater. Of course, all scholarly work seeks to better understand its objects of knowledge and refine the methodologies that allow it to do so. Human culture, in the wider sense, the primary concern of the humanities, has arguably never been more complex, nor has it ever been described in this immense complexity. Cultural processes and objects therefore represent a hugely challenging and rewarding object of study for scientific endeavor. Now, in one of the original formulations of this distinction between the humanities and the natural sciences, what the German philosopher Dilthey called Geisteswissenschaften and Naturwissenschaften, their distinction was built on the assumption that the expressions of the human mind, the concern of the humanities, could not be measured in the same way as natural processes. Yet, with the ongoing digitization of the human record and the increase in born digital culture, this distinction becomes, I think, very questionable. While not every aspect of culture is countable, many of them now are. From the number of words in a novel, the pixels arranged in a digital photograph, and the time that readers spend looking at certain aspects of an impressionist painting. Now, I'm aware that this is a polemical or maybe a polemical assumption or argument, or maybe a red flag. And I think what we confront here is one of the trickiest issues in this active collaboration between the humanities and the sciences. And this is where I come to methodology. And what I mean here with this tricky issue is the issue of abstraction, in the same way that in order to look at the pixels in an image, we need to abstract from other things in that image. I'm really enjoying what someone is doing with that slide there, by the way.
It's you then. I was wondering what's going on.
It's not me. I don't think I have time to engage in other things at the same time. I'm not good at that either. So let me come back to this question of abstraction. Now, of course, all disciplines abstract and have to abstract from individual case studies. But what is considered acceptable abstraction differs. For many humanists, reducing a novel to the words it contains or a photograph to its arrangement of pixels suggests a disregard for artistic value. Here we might lose those humanists who ultimately understand the study of culture as a quasi-theological exercise that recalls the interpretation of Holy Scripture. And of course, this is historically where the humanities come from. At the same time, it's worth insisting that interpretation fulfills central functions in all branches of science because they all produce narrative meaning out of disparate and conflicting results. As a consequence, interpretation retains its importance for the experimental or scientific study of culture. And that's very much, or my argument here is very much in contrast to Felsky. I don't think that the humanities, the digital humanities, or any other humanities or sciences are anti-interpretive. Yet the role of interpretation becomes more circumscribed and more localized, perhaps, when we introduce experimental procedures that depend on formal description and repetition. Now the question, and this is sort of my final question, becomes how the abstraction necessary for experimental validation can be made palatable to humanists who remain interested, and for good reason, in interpretation and critique. And this then brings me to this slide here, and I think that was on the poster that some of you might have seen. Okay, so what you see here is a heat map, so-called heat map. And this heat map visualizes the average gaze locations of 100 people who read these 2 pages from Paul Karasik and David Mazzucchelli's graphic novel adaptation of Paul Auster's detective novel, City of Glass. So the average gaze locations of 100 people who read these 2 pages from, if you want, a comic book. So it shows us what 100 people looked at, so to speak, when they read these 2 pages. Now, I have to say, I really like these heat maps. They're very neat, they're visually attractive, they make immediate sense. We can see that actual people reading these pages mostly look at text, despite the fact that comics are a visual medium. And that's an interesting result. As a literary scholar and cultural critic, this heat map therefore appeals to my desire for interpretation. And in my experience, other literary scholars love these heat maps as well. I've spent probably several hours in talks discussing these two pages. So visualization is certainly one way to make experiments attractive to humanists. But there are also problems with this heat map. It remains, and I think that is important, extremely abstract in the sense that it is isolated from its context. And as a consequence, gives too much freedom to interpretation, which is what the literary scholars sometimes like, but it curtails structural insight. Too much interpretation, too little structural insight. Why too much interpretation? Now, as I said, this is only an average of 100 people. It doesn't actually show us what individual readers looked at, and the differences are quite pronounced. There's a threshold built into this, a threshold that, as a consequence, shapes what you see as marked being red and green. If we lower the threshold, you would see, for instance, that the foot at the bottom of page 2, the left page, does draw some readerly attention. And then, of course, these are only 2 pages from a whole book. And if we have people read this in a laboratory environment, that is very different from actually reading in an everyday situation. They are looking at a screen, they have a camera in front of them. That's not how we usually read. Of course, this is only one visualization, but there is something in experimental setups that by necessity leads to abstraction. It's too expensive to have 100 readers read a whole book, and the laboratory situations need a sort of consistency. Now, I believe that reading studies like this are hugely important. It's a kind of outrageous sleight of hand in literary scholars that we practice to have the individual scholar stand in for all other readers as one expert. And too often we actually disregard what people read. But on its own, reading is only one puzzle piece of the literary system. And I think this is where insight comes from piecing together the puzzle pieces. So my argument, and I'll close on that, is that we need more puzzle pieces. And when we need for that are models, not simply heat maps, but models of the literary system or cultural fields that aim to do justice to the complexity of that account for what novels and films are produced, for how they circulate, and how ordinary people read and watch, for what they like and dislike. Unfortunately, the digital humanities haven't always done that, but I do think that is changing. There are projects now that try to understand cultural change and complex literary phenomena by modeling complex social systems. Now, in a very small and preliminary manner, my own research group has done that. It has asked what is produced by whom when it comes to the graphic novel, when are graphic novels republished and how often, what languages are they translated into, are there any film adaptations, who reads these books, how do they rate and review these books? And you can see some of that, or a representation of that on this slide. It doesn't look neat, doesn't look attractive, but it provides an overview of the database that defines relations between different elements of a literary system, In other words, this sort of model formalizes definitions, characteristics, and relationships. It aims at insight and gives context to interpretation, at once constraining interpretation and embedding it with wider frames of knowledge production. So the database as a model for insight, but also, and as importantly, as a model for collaboration. What we have here can be the basis for a different working culture in the humanities. Not that of the single scholar who argues their position, but an active collaboration that may include researchers from other sciences, because you can download this database, you can add data, you can look at it, you can change it, and you can challenge our results. So, as Andrew Piper has argued, and I'll close with this quote, cultural criticism in its traditional form resembles an agonistic process. One continually overturns the views of others. The explicitness of cultural analytics, and that's a different term for the digital humanities, means that others can share in the steps of the analyst's knowledge. They can correct those steps and challenge them, or they can build on them and refine them because those steps have been made more legible. Cultural analytics makes the study of culture more architectonic rather than agonistic, so we can build on each other's work, more social and collective. There is a basic politics to this practice, what Williams called active collaboration, that has been largely overlooked. Okay, then thank you very much for listening to me. It was over 50 minutes now, I see. If you have any questions later on or comments, don't hesitate to just drop me an email. If you want to read some of the stuff that I've been doing over the last few years, you can also go to this page and download things there. Okay, I'll hand over to you, Aditi.
Well, I'm going to hand it back over to you soon. So thanks a lot, Alex, for the fascinating talk and for something that I personally am definitely not very comfortable with. I'm like, all these experiments, what's going on? So I'll let others ask questions. I think there are quite a few in the chat window. Anuparna, if you could sort of...
Okay, sure. Aditi.
Should we do something like we let people ask questions? If they raise hands, I can unmute them clearly, or...
We have a few, so let's take them, and then we can actually, ask people to ask questions. What do you think?
Okay, that works.
So first, thank you, Alex, for such a rich lecture. Presentation. We have a few questions in the chat box. So here I have something from Otri Mazumdar. So he has asked that how have interpretative communities evolved in tandem with digital experimentations? Is it looked down upon as a disruptive intrusion or affirmed as much needed juxtaposition? Are empirical studies and attempts at quantification eroding the aesthetic pleasure derived from cultural artifacts? It's a long question, so if you could take that up.
So there are two questions now. I'll start with the latter one, really. I guess that would be a kind of ultimately a kind of subjective experience, whether the quantification erodes the aesthetic pleasure. I personally haven't made that experience that there's any cause and effect there, that kind of quantitative work has a negative effect on my own aesthetic experience. But that could be different for other people. I mean, I think generally what happens if you become a kind of scholar of something, your relationship certainly changes, no? Because it's not a purely aesthetic experience anymore. And the second question, if I understand, or the first part of the question rather, was about whether these kind of experimental approaches have been kind of welcomed as kind of addition or contrast interpretive approaches, or whether they have been kind of rejected. Again, that's a big question, and I think I could give a long answer, which I'll try not to do. I think there is both. certainly in my own experience, talking to scholars, let's say in literary studies, cultural studies, there tends to be a period of kind of skepticism, defensiveness, sometimes rejection. And then I think some people just leave the conversation who aren't interested. Of course, you don't have to be. I think no one's forcing you to be interested. I do think that this is changing. I mean, the digital humanities have a longer history, but under that umbrella have been sort of coming to people's attention for at least 20 years now. So I do see increased interest, sometimes for good reasons, namely because the research results are interesting, sometimes simply for the reason that there is money for the digital humanities, and there is more money for the digital humanities sometimes than for other approaches. What I would wish for is not the kind of parallel or a contrast, really, but an engagement with each other. And I think the digital humanities need interpretation. I made that argument early. And I think also close reading, historical arguments, interpretation can benefit from experimental and quantitative approaches. So I would really, and I guess I was trying to do that, argue for that sort of meeting place. Of course, there is a lot of work that doesn't need experimental approaches. I don't think that's necessary for everything, but I do think there can be a lot of productive overlap. I hope if that doesn't answer the question, then maybe raise your hand and we can talk about this.
So we have quite a few here.
Yeah, we have questions. Yeah, no, just about what you said. Actually, that was sort of what I would have asked. Sorry, my video is off, but that's all right, I think. It's that how far would these experimental methods take you? Because from what Hegel would call abstraction. So it gives you a sort of first level of abstract data, but dialectically you would need a more. Where do you feel like there's work done so far or that could be done which would give us a more concrete sort of dialectical picture of whatever you are working on, the individual text that you're working on? So I was wondering, just to extend that question, and then I'll let sort of the other question happen.
A more concrete in the sense that a more materialist understanding, I certainly think so, yes. Because I think good work in the digital humanities kind of at one point necessarily needs to choose a certain level of abstraction to work quantitatively, especially in a digital sense. But on the other hand, I think can bring in a lot of data drawn, let's say, from production, circulation, reception of literature and culture. If you want kind of, can draw in kind of social information that makes your results all the more kind of sort of concrete and relevant and embedded in the kind of society that you're studying. Does that make sense as an answer?
Well, I always think of it as delving into the text very deeply and pondering. So it's just such a different approach from what I have ever taken. It's just I'll have to get my head around it. But yeah, I'll let Anuparna ask other questions from the chat window.
Okay. Before that, just a request, if you could limit your questions to the topic or the topic that we have deliberated upon today, so that would kind of it's better that way. So we have a question from Dr. K.V. Surendran, and he says that, do you think C.P. Snow's observation on two cultures is relevant even in contemporary times?
Yeah, okay, that is an interesting question. And I'm not an expert on kind of C.P. Snow. I do think this was kind of sort of very polemical observation, meant as a polemical observation that perhaps in some sense then was taken too seriously. There was also a specific context to it. No, Snow was very critical of the British education system, saying that the British education system had put too much emphasis on a classical philological education rather than a kind of practical applied education. It seems to me that the kind of work that goes beyond actual one branch of the sciences is still relatively rare, and sometimes for good reason. I do think that work is extremely complex and takes a very long time, because even finding a sort of vocabulary that you share and that allows you to do work takes a long time. And as we all know, we're always encouraged to come up with results very quickly. And in my experience doing this research group with kind of computer scientists and cognitive scientists for years, the work with the computer scientists actually proceeded very well, because I think in some way that was easier. Because I think the quantification in some sense is an easier step. I think that cognitive science is a really kind of experimental science which abstracts almost completely from social context. Bridging that divide with the humanities, where context, social historical context, is extremely important, that proved very difficult, and we didn't get as far as I hoped. So just to summarize my answer, I do think it's kind of relevant as a kind of, as a thorn in our side, and as a kind of polemic to continue to react to, and maybe to continue to prove wrong. I don't think we have proven it wrong yet.
Thank you, Alex. We have a couple of questions from Antara. Antara, if you could unmute your mic and just go ahead.
Yeah, am I audible?
Yes, Antara.
Yeah.
Yeah, sorry for bypassing some of the other people who are still waiting with their questions. Thank you so much, Alex, for that wonderful talk. So just a couple of points for you to deliberate on, and just wanted your comments on those. So as a digital humanities practitioner, you were talking about some of the main problems in engaging with each other between the disciplines, in perceptions, in how the humanities and the sciences researchers perceive each other and the other disciplines, and problems in communication and engaging with the disciplinary methods or objects of the other. But as a digital humanities practitioner, what would you say, so other than the conceptual problems, what would you say was some of the main, or what are the main challenges that you face in your practice when it comes to using digital methods or tools? That was one. And the other was, this whole lack of communication or lack of comprehension between the humanities and the natural sciences that you were talking about, and which all of us also experience at different points of our academic careers. So is it kind of, other than the methodological differences, the reliance on experimental validation that we find in the sciences, is it also the displacing of the human, or the decentering the human with the digital, for instance, in digital humanities, or when it comes to things like environmental humanities, with the non-human, which of course these are all needed approaches in the humanities. But is that part of the problem, that how do we reckon with, or how do we reconcile with that decentering of the human? So That's
Okay, thank you. Those are really interesting questions, like the earlier one. The main challenges in using digital tools. I mean, I think one of the main challenges has to do with our kind of disciplinary education, certainly for me. I remember talking to a computer scientist who teaches a large introductory lecture at Paderborn, where I teach. And he said that students from the humanities don't practice. They are incapable, or they never learn to practice. And for instance, if you program software, or in a certain programming language, you need to practice constantly, because it's a process of trial and error. And in the humanities, we aren't really used to that. We aren't used to kind of trial and error and going back and looking what mistakes you made and then doing it all again. And on the other hand, he said that students from computer science never kind of make a kind of clear record and reflect on the record of what they were doing. So I think very often what I personally run into are the limits of my own disciplinary education. I'm not used to this kind of trial and error. That's a very sort of practical but basic problem. And then, of course, another problem very often is that doing digital humanities, there's often the assumption that one person will be able to kind of unify scholarly excellence, both in the kind of computational part and in the kind of humanistic, kind of critical, historical knowledge. And I think that's an illusion. So what we're looking at is you will have strength in certain areas, and by necessity, this is therefore teamwork, where you constantly draw on other people's expertise, practical knowledge, and where you depend on their help. And that's, I think, something that we aren't really used to as humanists, this kind of intense need for other people's expertise. We tend to kind of value our own expertise a little too much.
Yeah, absolutely.
The displacing of the human with the digital, or the human with the non-human, that's an interesting question. I don't know if I have an answer to that. I do think there's sometimes the assumption that these experimental approaches replace human subjectivity with some form of objectivity. I do think that's a total straw man. I don't think there's any of this replacement. If replacing the human with the non-human means some awareness of our limits and dependence and interactions with other agents, whether those are humans or non-humans, then I think that is very positive, because the digital humanities does practice you that you depend on computational processes. You pretend you really depend on these kind of experimental systems that Reinberger talks about. But I think one thing that's helpful for me there is really kind of the history of science, because I think there's wonderful work being done in that, and it's work that can kind of build a bridge between the humanities and the sciences by sort of by being critical and historicizing the sciences, but acknowledging some of the kind of expertise and practical expertise of the sciences, which I think we often in the humanities have a very shallow understanding of.
Yeah. Thank you, Alex, for those responses.
Thank you for the questions. I need to think about them a bit more, but that's what came into my mind first.
So we have another question from Aparna. So this is what she says, regarding your experimental study of the reader of graphic novels, Was there any difference in reading patterns in the case of in the case of comic, which don't have a linear or even discrete panels? Also considering the fact that text takes longer for us to parse than the visual, at least in the page that you have shown us, do the heat signature patterns really question the visuality of the comic?
Thank you. That's a very good question. Let me just, so the first one was about the linearity of reading, and the second one was about the reading time of text. Okay, so I'm not a cognitive scientist now, so my expertise in this is limited as well. Linearity of reading. Well, I mean, we do know from reading studies, of course, that reading isn't linear in the way that sometimes it's naively imagined. But I'm sure, Aparna, you know this. No, we don't read sentences by reading the first word, the second word, the third word, the fourth word, all the way to the end. And of course, that's not the case with comics either. However, the amount of kind of jumping between sort of panels that we would assume in a sequence is relatively limited, it seems. In other words, comic authors seem to be very good at suggesting formally or building formally a reading sequence. Where we do see these kind of non-linear jumps is if they're explicit references. So if there's an explicit reference in a later panel to an earlier panel, then of course you will get that. Otherwise, they were relatively limited. The reading time of text, that is a really fascinating question. Of course, it takes more time to read text. We need to focus our attention on text in ways that are different from taking in pictures, which we can take in often without focusing our visual attention on it. My understanding of the current literature, but there is quite a bit of that in the book that Aditi mentioned that I co-edited together with a cognitive scientist, empirical comics research. We don't quite have an answer to that question, in part because the methods that was used in this case doesn't really allow you as well to see kind of parafocal reading, no? So reading where I don't actually focus my attention on something. So there are some indications that a lot of how we take in the content of the images are by sort of quick glances, in that simplified and narrative comics drawing doesn't actually depend on the kind of same focus that you see in other visual media, for instance, in film. Does that? But as far as I understand, it's a question that's not fully answered, in part because we only started doing work on this, let's say 5-6 years ago.
Thank you, Alex. And then we have a provocative question from Unni Krishnan. So his question is, cultural materialism as advocated by Williams was political in content. Do you think we have lost that political vigor?
That's an interesting question. I mean, when you said polemical, I assumed something else. This seems like a do we have? I don't know who we is. I mean, it's interesting to me that if you talk to so many scholars whose work maybe isn't explicitly political, they will declare themselves lovers of Raymond Williams and of sort of cultural materialism. I think there has been a kind of watering down of some of the work that was done at that point, but I think there is a kind of strong political element in a lot of the work that is still being done in kind of literary in cultural studies. At least I wouldn't hope. I would hope that there is. But I mean, this is a kind of question where I would want to return the question and hear the answer. I'm not sure I have a kind of sort of response that's any more helpful than what this person would give me.
Okay, so we have another question from Otri, and this is, how is neoliberal politics related to digital humanities? Does it have an insidious tendency to move towards post-humanism? Is the confluence of technology and humanities conducive to the ideology of populist politics?
Wow, thank you for all these questions. I need to copy this chat because these are really amazing questions. There is a line of argument, of course, that the digital humanities at its strongest, as in the argument that it's strongest, is a kind of neoliberal project. I do think that's that argument is ultimately wrong. I do think that there is a confluence. There's definitely an interest, I think, by funding bodies, by governments often, to put money into the digital humanities because they think this will somehow make the humanities perhaps more profitable, perhaps less explicitly political, to link back to that earlier question. My own experience is that there is a lot of political work being done, explicitly political work being done in the digital humanities on questions of race, questions of sort of archives of underprivileged groups, on sort of supporting the kind of technological capabilities of underprivileged groups, but also in terms of critique. There's a lot of work, as I said now, on gender and race in the digital humanities that I think is very interesting. So I don't think there's anything inherently neoliberal in the digital humanities. I do also think that a lot of what goes under cultural studies has become sort of very comfortable in neoliberal universities, not because it isn't critical in any way, but because it kind of fits neatly and its critique is kind of accepted without that critique changing anything. The other, I don't know, I think the question about post-humanism, I think we would have to have a longer discussion about what this person means by post-humanism. For me, post-humanism isn't anything insidious or doesn't have any insidious tendencies, but maybe I have a different understanding of that. The confluence of technology and humanities conducive to the ideology. I'm not even sure I understand this question, but I don't think there is anything. No, I think actually, perhaps to the contrary, I think it's important today, if we look at kind of populist politics and the way it is played out via social media and other kind of digital technologies, I think a kind of basic understanding of the ways in which algorithmic culture and algorithmic systems like social media work can be an immensely helpful critical tool against this kind of populist politics. I think if I understand how companies like Facebook use digital technologies to kind of embolden populists, both in Germany here, in India, in the United States, I think that can be useful as a kind of element of critique and a tool to undermine that kind of populism.
Okay, we have a raised hand from one of the participants.
Yeah.
So maybe, yes, so maybe we can unmute. Lalit. Aditi, is it possible to unmute?
Yeah, I'll just do that. Yeah, just a second.
Sure.
I did unmute them, but I've asked them to unmute. They'll have to do it from their end.
Right.
If not, then you can ask the next chat question during
Yes,
that time.
maybe I should sort of. Yeah. So what do we have here? Let's see. Okay, so we have a question from Jaya. And she says that by creating interpretative procedures, won't we fall under the risk of homogenizing interpretations? As you stated, too much interpretation might lead to less structural systems, but aren't we in a post-structuralist world to move beyond structuralist views?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. Homogenizing the interpretation. Yeah, I mean, that does not sound too positive. I mean, the way I phrased it was kind of constraining or localizing interpretation, as in giving it a certain role. And in my experience, that comes at 2 points. It comes in formulating working hypotheses. I think interpretation is important and necessary there, and in interpreting the results of that thesis-driven experiment. Now, I don't think that necessarily homogenizes interpretation, but I do think it kind of localizes interpretation in the sense that it is part of a kind of stronger kind of methodology. What I do like about this idea of homogenizing in a positive sense, I'm kind of turning this, I think, against the way it was meant by the questioner, is that we actually do have shareable results that can support the interpretation, and that the interpretation becomes more grounded in other procedures and in the results of experimental procedures. So maybe if I can rephrase this, if we can say grounding interpretation, I would actually find that positive. As in systems, I'm not sure that all systems are structural, that systems are necessarily structuralist. I don't think we're in either a structuralist or post-structuralist world. But to be honest, I also think, maybe that's my background in critical theory, I don't even know what post-structuralism means. I think that was a term that was never particularly helpful. I don't think there's a contradiction between systems necessarily and interpretations. Maybe that's the point. But these are all, I feel like, questions that are so much better than my answers. So I can only kind of give a reaction, and I'll need to think a lot about it.
So we have more or less one last question from the chat box. I think you've kind of answered this, but nonetheless, if you wish to add something more. So this is from Minu, who says, during times of an existentialist crisis in humanities, shouldn't humanities scholars be upholding the purity of the discipline rather than trying to conform to the models of science?
Yeah, this is a really interesting question, and it's, of course, as we all know, a kind of question that's been much debated recently. I don't think, first of all, I don't think there is a purity to the humanities, or there ever was. If you look at the history of the humanities, and it's a relatively short history in some ways, there have always been lots of different approaches. And some of these approaches have been more empirical than others. And we've gone through phases where sort of empirical approaches were stronger at some point. For instance, in the 1970s, then maybe they are, and they're coming back. So I think one of the great things about the humanities exactly is that kind of impurity of the humanities and the impurity of humanities methodologies. I do understand, of course, but maybe that's not what the person means, but the argument, of course, that has been made very often is that that humanistic inquiry, historical, critical inquiry, interpretation is a value unto itself. And I would totally agree with that. I don't think that therefore we can't learn from the sciences. Again, if you look at the history of the humanities, we've always learned from the sciences because the humanities are part of the sciences, in my understanding. And ultimately, of course, that argument, namely the argument that only what sort of, makes a profit is kind of valuable, is also a problem for the basic sciences, no, rather than the applied sciences. So I would reject that argument in the interest of both the humanities and the sciences. Finally, I don't think what we should do is simply copy the sciences. The humanities are not a natural science, obviously. We're not looking at atoms. We're not looking simply at biological organisms, not that there's anything simple about them. But I do think that ultimately the humanities share a lot with the social sciences, and that very often what we look at when we look at culture are kind of social products as well. So I think we can learn without copying, and we can make a stronger argument on the basis of the argument that knowledge in itself, that interpretation, that critique is valuable, that there is something else that we can contribute, and that there's a way of understanding culture that has not been done before. And I really believe strongly in this, that so far what we have done in the humanities is only a tiny amount of what we can actually do, and that there's so much to understand. There's so much that is immensely complex about cultural processes that we haven't even begun to understand.
Thank you, Alex. I think that is more or less what we have in the chat box. So if you have any other question, please raise your hand, or else, it's over to Aditi. Aditi, you can take over.
Sure. I mean, if people raise their hands, I could unmute them. I've also asked people to sort of ask questions on YouTube, but I don't see any.
No, I don't see much. Yeah.
I mean, there's a question here about the medical humanities. I don't know. I mean, that's not directly related, although of course some.
Yeah.
Some
I mean,
of
Alex,
my
feel
work
free
could
to
be
also
put
look
in
at the
that box.
questions and see there are quite a few of them. If you want to have a quick look.
I'm going through this. Oh, someone was saying, I'm looking at political memes as a means of manufacturing consent.
Oh yeah, that's one question. I think that's one of the earlier ones which we missed, I think. So.
I mean, there is a lot of political memes. I mean, that really sounds like kind of quantitative social sciences, no?
Should we read out the question for the others?
Yeah, I can read it out. So, sorry if I'm mispronouncing the name. It's a question from Shruti S.U. to everyone. I'm looking at political memes as a means of manufacturing consent. And honestly, I do not know if I should fit in a known method to analyze them. If you could comment on methodologies to study memes in research, it would help. Thank you. I have to admit that I know too little probably about memes in the first place, or about quantitative social sciences to really help with that. I mean, my suggestion for this is always the DH 2020 conference just came to an end, which happened virtually this year, to look at the abstracts for that and see, or look at the abstracts of the last couple of years, and to see if there's anything on this. That's usually where, in my experience, a lot of the best kind of research in the digital humanities is first presented, and the kind of abstracts usually are very helpful because they include some kind of results and they include a description of the working method. So that's where I would go to. There's a couple of journals that are sort of well known and good, Digital Scholarship in the Humanities, Digital Humanities Quarterly. So personally, that's where I would go if I didn't have that method or didn't have that answer. Then just write to people. I think one of the, for me, very positive experiences in the digital humanities has been that because people depend on others' expertise, they're very willing to help often. Did we have, I thought I heard someone, but maybe I'm wrong.
Yeah, I think people aren't raising hands, which is fine. I think they're asking questions in the chat window. There's, I mean, how many more do you want to take? That's a question, because I mean, we've gone on for an hour and a half. You could take one last one if you wish.
There's two more questions there. No, let's do those. This is a really interesting question from, again, I apologize for mispronouncing everyone's name. Menu Joe said, do you think the pandemic will change the way the humanities are perceived in the world? I mean, one thing I'm certainly noticing, and I'm sure most of you are noticing this, is that they are changing our own work and our own research, and that they are making us aware of the kind of possibilities that kind of online teaching, that these sort of kind of virtual interactions offer to us, and that we can do a lot of work together virtually. I mean, I do think that means that kind of active collaboration, to use that term again, and across distances are possible in ways that perhaps we didn't quite realize before. I do remember flying to working meetings with colleagues from other countries just for half a day meeting. And I have done these kind of intense workshops now on Zoom or other platforms, and they do work. It's not quite the same because you can't go for dinner or a beer afterwards, but they do work. In terms of, will the view or the perception of the humanities change? I'm not sure that the humanities have been particularly good at making their voice heard during the pandemic. Of course, if you look for it, there are lots of very interesting reactions from humanities scholars. But I'm not sure that we've been very good at making clear that this isn't simply a kind of biological emergency or a kind of viral epidemic. And I'm not sure that humanists have really been that good at drawing attention to the kind of the cultural underpinnings and cultural consequences of this sort of work. But I think that's also in part because, for understandable reasons, we're now focused on getting vaccines and medical treatments, and I hope that this will come. I don't have the feeling at the moment this is strengthening the humanities, because it's very often in several countries that depend on student fees, what this means is that the budgets of humanities departments are being cut, that people are being laid off because students aren't attending in the same numbers as they were before. I don't see that in Germany because it's very much a kind of state funded system. But I do know about funding cuts for the humanities, both in the US and in Great Britain, which are kind of two academic systems that I'm in contact with. Did we have another question? Oh, there is a question here about cognitive poetics. And,
yes.
And the implications of cognitive poetics for reader response theories. I mean, I am someone who's willing to talk about a lot of different things, even when I'm out of my depth, to my own fault. But to be honest, I don't know enough about that to say anything that even seems meaningful to myself. I'd love to hear from this person. If you want to email me and tell me what you think the theoretical implications are, I think I would love to hear that, but I'm sorry that I don't have a kind of useful response.
No worries. I don't think there are more questions.
Okay.
I mean, yeah. I mean, if anybody has any questions, please raise hands and I can unmute you if you don't feel like typing. If not, then I suppose we could stop here and I'll hand over to Antara to thank you and
Yeah, thank you, Alex, for that very fascinating and engaging talk. And thank you for being so patient with the questions. We rarely see speakers being so patient with the questions and finding out questions from the chat box. So thanks again. And we hope that we can continue to have meaningful exchanges and dialogue. And you were just saying that these things, these online platforms for communication and connection certainly work. So we've had an instance of that right now. So this certainly very very useful and insightful experience for us. And I hope that we can also look forward to opportunities to use the term that you were using, active collaboration between some of us and you. So thank you again, Alex. Thank you to the audience. Thanks, Aditi and Anuparna, for managing this so well. And we look forward to more such opportunities in future. Have a great day, Alex.
Thank you. Thanks, Alex, everyone, for listening and asking questions. This was really fascinating.
We had a wonderful evening. Thank you, Alex.
Thank you. See you soon.
See you soon.
See you.
Bye.
Bye. Goodbye.